Okay.
Thank you for joining us for our webinar on mites. Before we begin, just want to let you know, in case you aren't already aware, that we recently rebranded and changed our name from Rainbow Tree Care Scientific Advancements to Rainbow Ecoscience. And this is just to simplify our name. RTSA is a pretty big mouthful, and it's a better ability for us to capture how we evolve in the way that we serve and support companies, municipalities, and organizations like yours without losing the legacy for our company. So we're excited for the change, and we're happy to have you here. Just want to start off with a quick safety brief. This is one of our core values here at Rainbow Ecoscience. So just a quick reminder to check your surroundings for your safety protocols. If you're at your home office or at a regular office, just have a glance around you, see if you have any trips or hazards. And if you're going to be in any inclement weather, be aware of that. If you are in a vehicle, please make sure that you are parked in a safe location, or if you're a passenger, that's totally fine too. This is me. Hi, I'm Allison Harrell. I'm an arborologist here with Rainbow Ecoscience. I am on the West Coast now, but I previously served the Midwest and worked actually quite a bit with Dr. Miller here. I provide support for Rainbow's territory managers, in-field training, and support for Rainbow's clients. So please feel free to reach out to us if you need anything. I will mostly just be doing the moderating as far as answering questions and typing things in the chat. So I will give Fred the floor here in a moment. Type your questions into the Q&A box. If you look at the bottom, there's a little panel. We will get to those questions at the end of the presentation. And then feel free to chitter chatter through the chat as needed, but try to keep any questions that are pointed to the speaker in the Q&A box. The webinar is being recorded, and a link will be sent out if you would like to revisit it. And this is worth 1 ISA CEU. So when you registered for the event, you should have had a box to put your ISA certification number. If you did not enter that, please put that into the Q&A box now. So your name and your ISA number, and we'll make sure that we get credits for that at the end. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Fredric Miller. He is a professor of horticulture at the Department of Ag and Horticultural Science at Joliet Junior College, JJC, that's in the Chicago metro area, and a senior research scientist in entomology at the Morton Arboretum. He did his undergrad in forest management at University of Missouri, his master's in forest entomology from University of Arkansas, and his PhD in urban forest entomology with a minor in plant pathology from Iowa State University. His research efforts primarily focus on sort of host plant resistance in ornamental woody plants for major insects, as well as biological control. He's done a ton of research and provides a lot of information for emerald ash borer and population dynamics with ashes, and has been actively involved with Illinois Arborists Association and ISA for decades, over 30 years, and is also a BCMA himself. So one of our most well-known peer-reviewed publications and technical articles, and provides a ton of awesome information to folks like you. So without further ado, I will send the screen to Dr. Miller. Thanks for being here with us.
Well, thank you for a gracious introduction there. I'll try to live up to all that. Pleasure being with you here. As Allison indicated, I'm here in the Chicago area. We had a little bit of a snowstorm yesterday, so to kind of keep us honest. So our topic today is on mites, and I'm going to give you just a little bit of very brief intro on where mites fit into the whole big scheme of things in terms of taxonomy, and then we're going to go right into the various types of mites and focus on their biology, are they important or not, and then of course some management options. So I will wrap things up probably 5 to 10 minutes before the hour, so that way we can answer any questions. So the mites are part of the group of arthropods. Arthropoda, of course, is the phylum. If you follow the taxonomy kingdom, animal kingdom, then we drop down to the phylum level, which includes our mites. And as you see there, you've got insects, the crustaceans, and of course arachnids, centipedes, and millipedes. These are all groups of animals. And of course, we encounter most of these. Some we encounter in restaurants, the surf and turf with the lobster, but a lot of these others we deal with in the field as well. And over my years of experience, most people will tolerate the insects with the 6 legs, but you add a couple of more legs on there with the spiders, mites, and ticks, and the wheels come off and people start to have a serious reaction to those. So we're not going to focus on those other than just the mites, but I just wanted to give you a little background on this. This is where they fit into the big scheme. And you can see here again the various critters that belong to these classes that are within the phylum Arthropoda. Again, we don't deal too much in arboriculture with the crustaceans, but of course, obviously we're out in the field. We have ticks, mites, spiders that we encounter. Millipedes are a little unnerving for people because of all the legs. I have a great amount of admiration for the millipedes because to get all those legs moving at once and they don't trip over each other. Sometimes I have trouble just with 2 legs. So I think they do a pretty good job. But they are primarily decomposers. You'll see those showing up in people's basements and cool areas in the home during the winter, or excuse me, when the summer, when it gets hot and dry, they like to move in because they like cool, moist environments. Chilopoda, which are the centipedes, they are predators and definitely are in the same type of environment that the millipedes are in terms of cool, wet conditions, but they are predators. And again, they kind of unnerve people because of their fast movement and such, but the ones we have here in primarily North America are really harmless. They're very beneficial. You go to other parts of the world and yes, they can be venomous and so forth. And then of course, our largest class within that group being the insects or hexapoda. So we'll get right to the mites here. These are just some examples. You probably all have seen the garden argiope on the far left there, quite colorful spider. They build the big webs when you're out walking around in the woods or in landscaped areas. You'll see them there. They're quite large, but again, harmless as far as humans are concerned. And they do reconstruct that web every 24 hours. So pretty amazing, all that silk that they produce. Going across the top, we've got a very engorged tick. I'm sure if you've had a pet or pulled one of those off your pet, they don't look anything like a tick when they're engorged. And then along the bottom, you see some of the other ticks, unengorged ticks. And then on the far right, of course, we have the dust mite, which is a microscopic organism that, of course, causes all kinds of allergies and allergic reactions to folks in the homes primarily. So characteristics, what makes an arachnid different than the insects? And I want to stress that because a lot of people tend to lump the mites and the insects together. Yes, we in horticulture, arboriculture deal with both groups, but it's important to distinguish between the two. Number one, of course, all your arachnids, spiders, mites, ticks have 2 body regions. Their head and their thoracic areas have been fused pretty much into one region called the cephalothorax, big fancy word there. And then of course the abdomen. That's different than the insects. They have a head, thorax, and abdomen. The 4 pairs of legs, that's standard equipment. Now I will comment here, nature always likes to throw exceptions at us and kind of keep us off balance. But just keep in mind when the mite, a very young mite, when it first comes from, hatches from the egg, it really only has 3 pairs of legs. So be careful with that. If you're looking at plants and you only see what you think is a mite, but it's only got 3 pairs of legs, don't let that throw you off because they will pick up that 4th pair later. But that's where you can get them confused with a scale crawler or some other critters. No antennae. And the last 2 points here, of course, are very general comments. There's always exceptions to this. I've seen some very tiny spiders from time to time that would be much smaller than a tick, but generally ticks are the smaller of the 2. And then of course, mites are usually smaller than the ticks. So we're going to talk about pest ID. How do we really nail down what type of mite we're dealing with? We're going to talk about their biology, economic impact, and then of course, some management practices. I know this has got a lot of stuff on it. I'm just going to point out a few things here. And this, with all the extremes we're having in climate and weather, flooding, droughts, the whole scheme of things, we need to keep in mind, regardless of what kind of pest we're dealing with, we have predisposing factors, as you can see up there in the upper left. These are things that, you know, we as humans and plants, of course, are exposed to on a regular basis. Of course, we've had plenty of this with the COVID thing for the last 2 years. But if you take that to the plant world, there's plenty of things out there: drought, flooding, chronic defoliation, extremes in temperature. All these kinds of things can be predisposing that kind of wear the plant down. Then we have inciting factors that are very short term, maybe sudden temperature drops, cold freezing and frost cracks. You know, we had a tornado go through my neighborhood this last summer. That was definitely a very short term but very damaging event. And then we get into contributing factors that come along as well. And all of these really kind of lead into what we call a decline spiral. On the left here, we have an example with Douglas fir. On the right, we have a red maple. But the message here is basically the same. We try to keep our trees as healthy as possible. And of course, that's the premise behind plant healthcare. That's the way it was designed, and that's the philosophy of it. But when you start adding in things like in the case of the Douglas fir, or even with maples, you start bringing in defoliation or nutrient issues with chlorosis. Then you add a scale problem, insect problem. You may have other things related to rooting space and so forth. On the spruce side, you've got bark beetles, which again are usually secondary insects, competition. And I put this in there because mites can be one of these as well. Mites can be some of these contributing factors that begin to wear down the plant over time. Usually a mite infestation, you know, once a few years is not going to be a big deal. But if you start seeing chronic mite infestations and effects, then eventually the plant begins to get into this spiral. And ultimately it leads to death, unfortunately. So those are things we want to keep in mind, regardless of whether it's mites or any other type of you know, factor. It could be a pathogen. We want to focus on this healthy tree. That's where we want to keep our plants. So just a quick review here of mite life cycles, and this applies really to all your mites. Of course, you have the adult, which lays the egg. Some of these mites that we're going to talk about overwinters an egg. That egg will hatch, and again, as I commented earlier, you can see they call it a larva. I prefer just an immature mite because that gets confusing, because then people think it's an insect and it's not. But you can see it just has the 6 legs. But then as they begin to go through their development to a proto-nymph and a pseudo-nymph, before they make the adult stage, they pick up that 4th pair. So that's the thing I was pointing out earlier. You want to make sure that you you know, double check that, because sometimes that can be confusing when you're out in the field and you may think you've got scale crawlers when in fact you actually have mites. And of course, knowing the biology of the mite when it shows up and the kind of damage it causes can also help you sort out those similarities. Okay, so let's get to our first group. These are the Eriophyid mites. Now these mites are extremely tiny. Even a hand lens probably isn't going to help you a whole lot on some of these, but you can see these are electron microscope shots of this mite. They're really kind of interesting looking critters, but less than a millimeter. So if you get your ruler out, look at that metric side and look at a millimeter, that's how small we're talking about here. They come in a variety of colors. But I think one of the biggest things that I like to use for identification, of course, is their shape. Shape is not a very good criteria for most insects and arthropods in terms of sorting them out. But in this case, this is a very good criteria, because all of our other mites, as we're going to see, are not spindle shaped, and they'll have the 4 short legs attached there. Multiple generations, which is very common with the mites, particularly for those of you in climates where you don't have a winter period or a dormant season. And I know several people were checking in from Nevada and California and so forth. You're going to have multiple generations. Here we have maybe 1 to 2 or as many as 4 or 5, depending on our summer months, but then things shut down in the winter. A lot of these Eriophyid mites will overwinter in bark crevices and under bud scales, places like that, where they are afforded some protection. They feed on leaf surfaces, wide variety of plants. You can see here evergreens, shrubs, deciduous plants, Some of them prefer more the maples and ash, walnut, cherry, and elm. Now here in the Midwest, where I'm located, we see a lot of these on maples in particular, where they'll cause some of the bladder gall mites and things that I'll get to here in just a minute. And then we also have problems with them on our ash. Now, granted, we don't have as many ash around because of EAB now, but the ones that are left, we will see what we call a blasting of the flowers. And this is very common on white and green ash. You'll see it very clearly this time of the year in the winter with the foliage off. The flowers are just, you can see the remnants of last year's blasting. They'll be dark in color, usually dark brown to black blasted flowers. And sometimes it can be quite heavy. It really doesn't hurt the tree that much. It's more of a cosmetic thing, and it does help cut down on all the seed that's produced. But we've done studies on this in the past, looking at control measures and such, and it's pretty hard to control it. You've got to get the product up into those buds before they open, and that's hard to do when you don't have really any transpirational pull going on prior to bud break, for at least for any systemic products. But in most cases, it's more of a systemic issue or a cosmetic issue rather. Then we get into some of the more obvious ones, and I'm sure you've all seen these, particularly those of you in the Midwest. Maples will show these bladder gall mites, gall damage, as we call them. They may be blisters or these galls that form on the upper leaf surface. You can see that on a maple here. They'll also form these, what we call uranium, which is a kind of a velvety patchwork of galls. And if you look at this under a scope, it's very bead-like. If you're familiar with any kind of embroidery or jewelry that has little beads worked into the fabric or worked into the garment, that's kind of what it looks like under a microscope or a hand lens. And these bladder gall mites will start off kind of a green color. They'll be coming up from the dorsal, I'm talking insects now, the upper surface of the leaf. And then eventually they'll go through a color change. They'll go from a green to kind of a light pink. And then by the end of the season, they usually are a pretty brilliant red, almost the same color as this uranium gall. It's, again, mostly cosmetic. Yes, it does interfere with photosynthetic activity and the ability of the plant to make food, but it's not something that's going to kill the tree or cause serious damage that way. But again, like I was saying earlier, it is one more factor there that we have to deal with in the urban environment or in landscapes. But that's a very common thing you'll see with the bladder gall mite. And then, of course, I mentioned the blasting from the ash flower gall mite. So indicator plants, I don't know if you all are familiar with this, but Don Orton, who was Illinois Department of Agriculture nursery inspector, spent years, I think several decades, collecting data on pests and what he called indicator plants. These were plants that as he was in the nurseries doing his inspections during the growing season, he would look around and see what was going on plant-wise. And so he was keeping track of the pests that he was seeing, but then also recording plant development. And this is, we all have used degree days and still do use degree days to predict insect activity when they're moving from one life stage to another and so forth. But the indicator plants really help tighten that up. As you all know, in the spring, we can get some really dramatic changes in weather. And, those degree days are based on averages or means in many cases. And so you can get pretty close with them, but the indicator plants really help narrow that down, tighten that up, because they're undergoing the same environmental conditions as your pests are and reacting accordingly. So these are just some examples of indicator plants. Now, from what I'm seeing, people are tuning in from all over the United States. So you can select your own indicator plants. The ones that Don Orton lists and coincide in his publication, his book, they're obviously plants that he was familiar with here in the Midwest and are fairly common. If you're in another part of the country, you can come up with your own list. Plants that are, common that you can easily identify, that are consistent in the environment, and develop your own list and start making observations and see what happens when certain insects are out in certain life stages and what's going on plant-wise. But all that to say here, red maple beginning to blossom. You've got honey locust buds are beginning to show green. So obviously very early in the season. We can still have snow on the ground in some cases here in northern Illinois when that's going on. But between 50 and 100 degree days, and that's base 50. Of course, base 50 is a threshold that's used for insect and insect relatives, which the mites are, as a developmental threshold. Once you get below that, they really don't do much physiologically. And that's a pretty standard average for most arthropods. Now, there are a few insects that may start development at 45 Fahrenheit, and that sort of thing, but we usually use 50 degrees Fahrenheit to monitor for this. So that's kind of it. And so this is very early in the season. In fact, we've had some springs here, well, particularly the 2012 spring here in Illinois, Midwest, where we had that very early spring and of course had the drought. We were well into this range by late March and April. So we were running about 6 weeks ahead of time. What'll happen this year, who knows, but it can come pretty early. And as I tell my students at school, your calendar is fine for social, planning your social life and all that sort of thing, but it's really not very helpful for pest management because every year is different and it's all a function of temperature. So they're active at between 50 and 100 degree days on those. The other ones, we have hemlock and spruce Eriophyid mites. For those of you in different parts of the country, we have spruce here. It's primarily the Colorado blue spruce is a very common landscape plant. Those of you in other areas may have different species, but again, these are some additional indicator plants. And the thing you have to be careful here is that sometimes this Eriophyid mite damage on spruce will look a lot like spruce spider mite, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. You won't see that so much on deciduous plants. Eriophyid mites, as I pointed out, cause the galls and the blasting and all that. You're not going to see that with two-spotted spider mite and those kinds of, and honey locust mite, because they're on deciduous plants and they do different types of damage. But again, the take home here is that these Eriophydes are out very early. You look for off-color foliage. Of course, they are feeding on the fluids and the juices, if you will, in the plant leaf and the cells. And also, of course, they're disrupting all your photosynthetic activity. Now, mites tend to slash or cut open the cells and extract the contents. That's a little different than leafhoppers and aphids and those kinds of sap-feeding insects. They actually puncture the cell. So think about a water balloon. All right, I think we can all relate to that. If I'm a mite, I'm going to go up and slash that water balloon, and I'm going to let the contents leak out, and I'm going to suck those contents up for food. If I'm a leafhopper, plant bug, an aphid, some of those critters, then I'm going to puncture that balloon and then suck the contents out. So in the feeding process, that makes a big difference in terms of how the plant responds. And of course, the chloroplasts, the organelles that are inside that cell that are involved in helping make food through photosynthesis are going to be destroyed or damaged. And so you start seeing that off-color foliage, chlorosis, yellowing. Got to be careful you're not misdiagnosing and thinking it's a nutrient issue. So again, you have to confirm all that. And if you've got a 10 power to 20 power hand lens, you usually can see these mites. If you've got good eyeballs. Now I'm finding the critters are getting smaller and smaller for me, so I'm having to wear my cheaters more, but usually if you got good eyesight, you can see them. And again, you'll many times with heavy populations, you will see the old calf skins, the old exoskeletons that are left behind if there's populations really growing and expanding. Mites, you can go with a dormant oil application. I want to stress a dormant oil application, not necessarily a dormant oil. Historically, we used to talk about dormant oils. These were only oils you could apply in the wintertime because they weren't very clean or purified. They had other contaminants in them, sulfur and other chemicals that would damage plants. We're talking here about the time of the application, not the type of oil. So I just want to make that distinction because, historically we've talked about dormant oils, and that, doesn't mean a whole lot now. Now we talk about when the oil is applied. So you can apply it to kill overwintering stages. Again, understand with oils, you have to cover the insect or the mite with the oil. You're basically suffocating them. You're cutting off their air supply. So you've got to get good coverage to be effective with that. Galls, as I mentioned, if you're going to try to control those, you're going to have to hit them right at bud break. My experience with systemics has not been all that effective because, again, you don't have the leaves out yet, and you don't really have any way of getting that product up into the canopy through transpirational pull. And your leaf feeders, of course, if you're finding some that are actually feeding on the leaves, you can hit those with any kind of a contact product if you want. But dormant oils, and of course, you got to be careful on Colorado blue spruce. If you choose to use a dormant oil there, you will change that to a green spruce. And you can literally watch that happen as you spray the tree. So I would stay away from oils, dormant oils on Colorado blue unless you want to make them green, because it just basically dissolves that blue locust covering wax that's on the needles. And now if your client doesn't mind, that's fine. And the new growth, of course, will come out, blue. But it's a little disturbing to sit there as you're spraying. You watch that tree go from blue to green. And of course, with your dormant oils, be careful, dormant oil applications, be careful that you're above freezing. You do have a wide window during the dormant season, but you've got to be above freezing when you apply it, at least for 24 to 48 hours, so you don't do any plant damage. And typically, dormant oil applications fall in the 3 to 4% by volume range. So if you're doing a 100-gallon tank, you're going to put in 3 to 4 gallons of oil. Summer sprays, summer oil applications would be down in the 2 to 3. Some go as low as 1%, but just depends on the critter and how well you can cover them with it. But you do have to cover the mite or the insect. Okay, our spider mites. We're going to shift gears here now and leave the Eriophyids. We're going to go to the spider mites. They're called spider mites because they produce all this webbing that you see here in the upper right corner. That's where they get their name. Looks like spider webbing. Of course, you can see the little tan flecks in here. Those would be mites that are in that webbing. You'll also see immatures. You'll see the calfskins, exoskeletons, and even some eggs possibly on the leaves. So those are things you want to look for as signs. Signs are things, of course, that are associated with the causal agent, whether it's an insect, a mite, a pathogen, visual things that tie you directly to the pest or the pathogen. Symptoms, of course, you're going to see yellowing and bronzing of the foliage if it's a heavy infestation. Plants are going to start losing their vitality. They may start to wilt. And of course, if it's severe enough, you'll see dieback and death. And that, of course, that can be very common in greenhouse crops and some of your more herbaceous plants. On some of your conifers, like you see here in the lower right, the needles will be kind of an off color, kind of what I call a dingy color, dingy green, not real vibrant. And of course, you'll find the webbing in among these needles. Again, very small, 0.5 millimeter. Now, the cool season mites, of course, would be your spider mite, spruce spider mite. And as it implies, they're more active in the cooler portions of the summer. So they're right in there with the Eriophyids. They're going to come out very early in the season when it's still cool. Once you get into the warmer, hotter periods of the summer, they're going to go into what we call estivation, which is a summer form of diapause. In other words, they shut down and they just wait till things cool down a little bit. And so they're going to come back again in late summer, fall, and resume their feeding at that point. But they are called a cool season mite. And that's the main one we have here in the Midwest. Now, again, a lot of you are from all over. And so you may see other types of cool season mites, but that's the main one we see here is the spruce spider mite. Immatures are kind of yellowish green. You can see the adult up here is more of a grayish black. You really shouldn't have any problem confusing it with two-spotted spider mite because the two-spotted has 2 spots on each side. Obviously, we entomologists are very imaginative with our names. So if we see 2 spots on a mite, we call it two-spotted spider mite. But you can see they contrast quite a bit there. Eggs will be oval, reddish brown, and again, they overwinter on the bark and needles. So initially with light feeding, you're going to see this stippling effect kind of, and again, it can move to a bronzing appearance if there's heavy mites. And then of course, when it really gets out of hand, you'll notice all of the webbing in the needles. And again, as I said earlier, kind of a dingy, from a distance, the tree will look dingy or off color. It doesn't look real healthy. And as you get closer, of course, you'll see the webbing and the mites embedded in that webbing. 100 to 200 degree days, base 50. Now, again, getting back to the degree day thing, you know, you have to really pay attention in the spring in the Midwest and even in the Eastern US, because things can change very quickly. We can go along here in Illinois for weeks and not generate any degree days. And all of a sudden, along about mid-April, we hit some 70s and 80s during the day and things just take off. So don't, you know, if you go out 1 week and you're at 0, just bear in mind next week things could pick up quite quickly and you could be behind the curve, you know, before you know it. So these are ranges. Also, you want to pay attention to micro climates. City of Chicago, for instance, and any big city is going to have a heat island effect. We have Lake Michigan there that moderates temperatures dramatically. So here in the wintertime, we may be 10 below 0 out here in the suburbs where I am. It may only be 0 downtown Chicago because of the lake and because of the heat island effect. So if you have plants that are situated in protected areas in large cities, those of you that might be along the lake or any of the lakes for that matter, that's going to moderate temperatures. And so those animals are going to develop more quickly in the spring compared to other areas. We have a lot of that with the North Shore here in Chicago. They lag way behind the Morton Arboretum, which is about 30 miles west of the city, due west in terms of degree days. And then of course you have to look at aspect. If that plant is situated on the south side of a light colored building, sun hits that, reflects that heat off of that building, those plants are going to develop more quickly, and everything that's on that plant is going to develop more quickly as compared to, say, plants growing on the north side of a building. So these are all things you have to take into account because you can get caught if you don't monitor that. Again, some more spring indicator plants. A lot of your maples you notice here are involved in this, and of course the Amelanchier. These are good, and of course there's plenty of Norway maples around, and also silvers to use as your indicator plants. But like I said before, if you're in a different part of the country, choose your own indicator plants. This system has widespread application. It's been tested in Michigan. It's been tested here in Illinois. We use it consistently at the Arboretum for monitoring pests. And then, as I said, the mite will go into kind of an estivation or resting period when it gets hot and not come back out until fall. So here's some of your fall indicator plants. You've got your hawthorn, your dogwood, and again, your silver maple going into various forms of fall color that you can use as general indicators and at least get you in the ballpark instead of just kind of going out there and hoping you hit it right. Preferred hosts, spruce, pine, hemlock, arborvitae. Here for us, we see it mostly on Colorado blues and arborvitaes. I don't see it too much on Norway spruce per se, but definitely the Colorados and very common on arborvitaes. But if you have these plants in the landscape or wherever you're managing plants, those would be your prime ones. And of course, there's some others, some of your other gymnosperms, the cedars and yews, larch and so forth. But the spruce and arborvitae really are key. And again, like most mites, you know, several generations per year. And that, again, be on the lookout out there, 50 to 100 degree days, at least be looking around and checking. And here's that off color, this picture lower right, that's what I was talking about, kind of that dirty brown, dirty light green, just doesn't look good. That's usually a good indicator. Then we have our warm season mites. These are mites that are going to come out later in the season. And when temperatures get warmer, they kind of fill in the gap between the cool season mites. We have two-spotted, we have European red mite and honey locust mite. And as I mentioned, two-spotted is very easy to identify. They're kind of a pastel light green tannish color, and then they have the two very prominent dark spots on either side of the body. This is your European red mite, which like reddish in color, so it looks very easy to identify. And then of course the honey locust mite, which is again similar in color to your two-spotted, but they don't have the spots. So that, and of course it's very host specific. You're only going to find it on honey locust. Anything that grows is going to probably get hit by two-spotted. Greenhouse crops, woody ornamentals, landscape plants, just many host plants, vegetable crops, and so forth. Again, similar in size to all the other mites we talked about. I described the color with the two black spots. Eggs are going to tend to be more of a light color, as you can see in this lower picture, white to yellow color, and usually clear, translucent. So again, it's not unusual to see the whole gang there. You got the adults, you got the teenagers, you got the eggs. They can all be right there in one general location, particularly under heavy populations. And a lot of times they like to tap into that main vein, kind of like little pigs at a trough. They just tap in there and pull the sap out. The females do overwinter, and they're going to be reddish orange or overwinter in bark cracks. And here you can see they're going to be active at 900. That should be 1,000. I'm sorry for the typo. Active at 900 to 1,000 degree days by 50, and again multiple generations. I know being out in California a few years back, I remember touring a greenhouse where they were growing red roses for cut roses, and of course hot and dry, and they had to be very careful with the mites in there because they could just explode on them. As I mentioned, they feed, all the mites here feed on the leaf juices, if you will, and they rupture those plant cells. And of course, initially it's going to look something like this, kind of a stippling effect. And then of course, as the feeding continues, you get more of the coalescing of these individual feeding sites. So you get more of a bronzing off color. Now, again, you have to be careful. You don't jump to conclusions and think this is mite damage. It could be a nutrient deficiency. But then if you start seeing the webs, then that's a pretty good indicator. But it could be a combination too. This could have started off as a nutrient deficiency and the plant is not as healthy as it could be, is having problems, and then the mites move in. And they can move in very quickly. You can look on plants and one day they look perfectly fine, and a few days later, they're covered with mites. So they're like aphids and whiteflies and some of these sap-feeding insects. They can balloon on you very quickly. So if you're going to be monitoring for mites in the landscape, you're probably going to need to be out there once a week at the least, particularly when the conditions are favorable. And that's where your degree days and your indicator plants can help you a lot with that. So stippling, particularly in hot weather, because that's where these mites thrive. You probably all know the very sophisticated technical way of sampling for mites. Just carry a light sheet of paper with you. You can use your hand, or you can use a rod or whatever, hit that branch or that part of the plant, and the mites will drop off on the paper. And of course, then you can begin getting an idea of what type of mite you're dealing with and their density. I will tell you, you do want to account for your natural enemies. There are predaceous mites out there. I know this sounds a little goofy, but we do have kind of a rule of thumb I find pretty helpful in the field. When you're trying to sort out whether they're a predaceous mite or a pest mite, first of all, the predaceous mites are going to move a lot faster. Now that should make sense, because if you want to capture your lunch or your dinner, you're going to have to move faster than your food. So the predaceous mites will be scurrying around much faster. And then you can do what we call a very sophisticated test called the squish test. If you squish the mite and it comes out kind of a greenish color, clear color, that usually indicates that it's a pest mite. It's feeding on the plant sap, much like what honeydew looks like when it comes out the south end of the north-facing aphid. If they tend to stain or squish a little darker, or even possibly reddish, if you really use your imagination, then that's usually a predatory mite. So the speed of the mite's movement and the squish test can give you a pretty good idea of what your makeup is. And of course, if you're running, I don't know, 50, 60, 70% predatory mites, you might want to back off and give them a chance, because if you go in there and spray a miticide, you're going to kill all the predatory mites for sure, because they're not nearly as tough as the pest mites. And of course, you'll kill most of the pest mites, but then they're going to just rebound on you. So you want to keep that in mind in your pest management assessment and your sampling. And of course, lady beetles will be much larger and much more obvious to you. And again, you want to take assessment of that, because again, anytime you use a general broad spectrum insecticide or even a miticide, that can really knock your natural enemies down. And when that happens, then things can really get out of hand in a hurry. So your early summer indicator plants, wild carrot is a good one, or otherwise known as Queen Anne's lace. And then a yucca plant is another good example there for some of the early two spots. And then you get into your mountain ash and some of your other plants for later indicator plants. But usually once they start, well, for us, it can be June-ish, late June, July, depending on our weather. If we get into a lot of hot weather, they can show up pretty quick. Again, as I mentioned, monitor, especially during hot, dry weather, sunny locations on a weekly basis. And as it says here, they can produce a new generation per week, one per week. So you can see how fast that can boomerang on you. Oils and soaps can be helpful. Again, this is going to be on plants that, well, particularly vegetable crops, where you really are limited on what you can use on food crops. If you really want to go, you know, on low toxicity for landscape plants, you can use these products and help conserve your natural enemies. But be advised that, you know, as soon as the oils and soaps dry, they're done. They have no more mode of action. They're strictly contact insecticides. They work when they're in a liquid form, but the minute they dry, that's it. Now that has good advantages if you're running a garden center or a nursery and you've got people handling plants and people purchasing plants. You know, these are good knockdown products so that you don't have to worry about any toxicity issues or exposure issues. But if you're looking for not having to come back for a week or two, then you might want to, you know, start with oils and maybe rotate with a miticide or whatever, because again, these products are not going to give you any residual control. And again, keep in mind that with your residual products, you're gonna have an impact on your natural enemies. Okay, our next one is the European red mite. This one is not quite as common in landscapes for the most part. It's more of a apple pest, can really wreak havoc in apple orchards and other fruit areas. But occasionally we can get it on some of our evergreens, junipers and things like that. Eggs are kind of interesting looking things. They almost look like Christmas ornaments. These are easily seen on the foliage and woody parts of the host plant. And of course, on fruit crops, they will affect the leaves, which of course in turn affects your fruit production, just like you have with pathogens like apple scab and some of those things, and also can cause a rusting of the fruit. But fairly distinctive red color to the mite with the white hairs coming off the top of the dorsal surface. 6 to 8 generations here for every 2 weeks. They can crank out a new generation. Female mites tend to be more of a brickish red color with the white spots at the base. And you can see the hairs there on the back on the dorsal surface. Males are a little more slender and lighter in color, but these are be very easy to distinguish, you know, when you're in the field because of their color and so forth. Of course, there's the eggs, as we pointed out. They are onion shaped. They do overwinter as eggs near the base and spurs on small branches. You can see the eggs here, again, on a darkish gray bark background of an apple or crab apple or some of the other hosts. You can see those pretty readily. And that's a good time to hit them with an oil application to smother those eggs. But again, you have to cover those eggs thoroughly to get the job done. Spring egg hatch, eggs are, and in the summer, then after you have additional generations, they'll start laying them on the undersides of the leaves. So that's going to make it a little harder to see them. Turn those leaves upside down, take a good look underneath. Here it is on some of your twigs and branches and spurs where they've overwintered. And again, about a 7 to 14 day egg hatch period, and it's temperature dependent. That's why you have to pay attention to the weather and you know, what kind of temperatures are you getting? Is it staying consistently warm or hot? Then that's going to speed up development. Damage, just like all of them, they remove the cell contents, including the chlorophyll. So that's why you get this chlorosis and off-color appearance, as you see in the upper right. And you get a pale appearance. Heavy feeding is going to lead more to bronzing, like you see down here in the lower right on an apple. And I know, you know, early on years ago, we didn't have, as arborists, we didn't have much to do with fruit trees and all that sort of thing and landscapes. But as I'm finding more and more, people are planting dwarf fruit trees and that sort of thing. So you're going to run into these critters. And I think it's a good idea for all of us to, you know, have this background because, you know, you may go on a landscape and people have several dwarf fruit trees there that they want protected from mites or cobbling moth or other things. So that's another service that can be provided. And it's always good, of course, to be up to speed on that. Red Delicious is a preferred host. Rayburn, I'm not real familiar with that variety. Of course, Red Delicious I am. But just keep in mind, most of your apple varieties can get European red mite. It does say it's rare on backyard apple trees. I think part of that is because people maybe spray more, or maybe they just don't even recognize that it's a problem. But you still need to keep an eye out if you're monitoring those kinds of sites. We have a number of predatory mites, lady beetles, thrips is another one there that can help control populations. The thrip, adult thrip, will have fringed wings. They're very, very small insects, very slender, but they have the fringed wings. And of course, they're also a major problem in our greenhouses. European red mite is a secondary pest in many respects. But again, it has to do with insecticide application. So maybe even if you're not spraying those trees directly, if you're spraying other plants in the landscape, you may be affecting natural enemies that actually are controlling the red mite. And this is one that orchard growers really have problems with. They'll go in to control a pest that's you know, a major pest and upsets the entire, no pun intended here, guys, the entire apple cart because, you know, the mites have been under control by natural enemies, and all of a sudden those get wiped out because they sprayed for something else, and then you have this secondary pest outbreak. So you can get pest resurgence where the pest just really explodes on you after a treatment, or you can get secondary pest outbreaks. So that's where we really have to be careful with some of our broad spectrum insecticides, making sure we're applying them appropriately and not, you know, really throwing things out of kilter. Here it is on Arborvita. That's where I've seen it a lot more. And again, thinning of the canopy, off color of the foliage. And of course, if it's really heavy, you'll see the webbing in there. But that's one that really can ruin an Arborvita. You put bagworm and European red mite together, and it can be a real mess for any of your Arborvitas or evergreens. These are just some general guidelines. Obviously, you've got aesthetic thresholds you have to deal with and your clients and what their expectations are. But on fruit trees, these are some general guidelines you can use for sampling and determining where you are with your populations. Hand lenses, of course, are extremely helpful here. And, you know, like I said, this is just kind of a guideline. So you can adjust that as you see fit. Miticides usually early in the season if you've got more than 5 per leaf. April and May if you're getting up to 10, and then the rest of the season if you're at 15. So again, these are just general guidelines. You'll have to make your own adjustments as you go along, depending on your location, and of course the number of host plants you have, and again your client's expectations. Okay, management, we talked about that quite a bit. Dormant oil applications, and again, you're out there early. Bud swell until 1/2 inch green. a lot of these same criteria are used for other fruit tree pests. If you read your local recommendations, they'll have a whole series of sprays that you have to do throughout that time when trees are coming out of dormancy until fruit set, for a lot of things, codling moth, scab, all those kinds of problems. Okay, the last one I want to cover here, because I know I'm getting close to time, is the honey locust mite. This is a native mite, but it is host specific to honey locust, which of course has been widely sprayed and planted throughout the United States as a replacement for the elms when they died from DED. Orange in color, they do overwinter as adults, as you can see here, in bark cracks and crevices, and of course easy to see on the dark bark of a honey locust tree. Eggs are laid in the spring and hatch. And again, this is a very common appearance that I see of a lot of this white material. That is old calf skins that have accumulated there. And then you can see the young mites scattered along there. And again, they like that midrib, mid-vein. That's where they tend to feed. So you can look for the orange mites on twigs and branches where they're overwintering. And this can give you a pretty good idea of what your mite population is going to be the following season. Stress trees, of course, honey locust is widely planted in parking lot islands and restricted root spaces, and some of them just really are always struggling with transpiration issues and lack of water and so forth. So that's where the mites usually like to show up first. And I've seen this many times along about July and August. You'll see mite populations in many of these trees that are planted in those landscapes. So you get the bronzing effect. And you got to be careful you don't confuse this with mimosa webworm, for those of you that might have that. There you'll see the webbing and the caterpillars feeding. If you look at the underside of these leaflets, this is what you're going to see. Here's some eggs. There's an adult mite. You have all these leftover calf skins and exoskeleton for when the mite's molted down here in this whitish like material. But again, they like that mid-vein to feed. Again, dormant oils can work for heavy populations. You can also apply verdant oil during the growing season, but usually that's going to be at a 1 to 2% rate. You got to be careful. It's not a hot day, low humidity. You can burn plants. So you want, again, watch your weather conditions. And then, of course, if you have problems, you can always go to a summer application with a residual product. So keep your plants healthy. Watch your fertilization. That promotes a lot of pest and disease problems. If you overdo it, you provide all that new succulent, juicy growth, makes it very appetizing for a lot of your sap feeding insects, and of course can make those plants more vulnerable to pathogens. Do your monitoring and inspection, watch your natural enemies, and of course, then as we've talked, if you need, you can knock them down maybe with a biorational, an oil or soap or whatever, or you can go with residual products. So I'll be glad, I think I've got about 5 minutes here. I'll be glad to take any questions if we have any.
Okay, so I'm trying to share my screen really quickly, because what I will do, I'm going to take just 1 second, which is Fredric, thank you for covering all of that. So awesome. This is not a rainbow commercial, but of course we are here for you guys. And I'm just putting out this really quickly. Exactly what Dr. Miller just said. Most of my outbreaks are not going to warrant chemical control. Always use that toolbox approach. Horticultural oils are a super awesome option for control. Just at the bottom here, 3 kind of main points, as Dr. Miller just said. There are a few things that work if you have severe infestations. That's what Rainbow is here for, if you guys have questions on that. But just highlighting really quick, our Lepitech soil applied acephate is a soil applied option for spider mites. I think that's a really great tool when you've got severe infestations of something like spruce spider mite, personally, versus trying to hose down a massive spruce tree. Abamectin comes in a couple of formulations. Arachnid is a trunk injection when you absolutely cannot spray, just nice to have in the toolbox. And then Lucid is a foliar application of that. That one's kind of nice on your boxwoods. I don't know if you see this a lot, Fred, but we'll occasionally get really bad spider mite outbreaks as well as really bad box wood leaf miner outbreaks, and people are like, what do? I want to treat for this. And your option is either spray the thing 8 times, or maybe you can come in and just get a kind of one and done application. So again, always using our brains for what options we've got. And then things like biphenamide, like a narrow spectrum miticide, something that can preserve your beneficial mites. As you noted, that's super, super important. So without further ado, I will let you take questions.
I just want to follow up on that too.
Yeah.
You brought up the point of different products. Anytime you're dealing with any insect, particularly insects that have multiple generations, aphids, mites, whiteflies, all these critters, you really want to mix it up. Using the same product that has in the same chemical group is really not what we need. We're talking about using different modes of action, like Allison has indicated. Weave in your oils and soaps if you can, because what's going to happen is, and we're seeing this all the time in greenhouses and other places, you're going to start seeing resistance. And once you get into the resistance thing, you've pretty well lost that product.
Yeah,
so
totally.
Shifting from one pyrethroid to another, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about doing a pyrethroid, then maybe coming back with something else that has a completely different mode of action. Lepitec is orthene, that's been around for years.
Yep.
And we've used that a lot on other sap feeding insects, and it's proven to be very effective. But I do want to make that point. We really got to rotate and be very deliberate at that.
Yeah, so that actually leads perfectly into the first question, which is resistant management suggestions on miticide rotation schedules. I think you pretty much just answered that, but Randall, if you want to reach out to us, and I guess what I will counter your discussion with too, Fredric, a lot of times with these mite issues, you can just do 1 or 2 seasons of applications and get those populations knocked back. So you're hopefully not going to be dealing with large resistance issues if you're only doing a treatment for a year or 2, right? But yeah, so I think you answered that one. Why do imidacloprid applications cause spruce spider mite outbreaks on hemlock?
Right. And also, I know this is really touchy, but if you're in areas where they do a lot of fogging for mosquitoes, that can be an issue too. And I know Mike Ropp at University of Maryland has seen this with scales and such like that. So those are just things to be aware of. If you've got a community that's fogging regularly, that can really throw things out of whack too. And I know that's a tough one, because mosquitoes are of course a huge problem, and people are going to try to keep them at bay. But if you're having a lot of problems with mosquitoes, you may see outbreaks of other stuff because of that fogging issue.
Yeah. Okay. We've got a couple of questions around systemic applications. So I don't know if you want to answer these or if you want me to take them on, but someone just asked any systemic applications. And then someone said, will systemic applications shouldn't affect beneficials, but it depends on the chemistry. So I don't know if you want to take that.
That's been a very common question. We had that a lot with emerald ash borer with systemic applications there. There's been no indication that work I've done with the parasitoids that we brought in, there's been no indication that they've been affected by any of the insecticide treatments, because quite frankly, they feed on living larvae. So if the larvae are dead, they're going to ignore them anyway. So they're not going to come in contact with that. I've not seen any other indicators for pollinators. Again, particularly on ash and some of those species. Now, granted, if you've got trees that are, high priority pollinator plants that insects belong to, but I've not seen any reports where it shows up specifically to affect natural enemies. So I think if you use good judgment, watch when you do it, time of treatment, I would say you're more likely to have an impact if you're doing a foliar application or something like that, as opposed to systemics. But yeah, study up on your plants, see how they flower, when they flower, what types of pollinators come to them, if any, and base your decisions on that. So yeah.
Yeah, and if you guys have specific questions, feel free to reach out to our tech support. Okay, in the honor of time, we will continue to answer questions, but I just want to say the ISA CEU course code is up on the screen right now. You should be able to see it. It's PP-22-037. So for those of you who need to jump off because it is the top of the hour, please feel free. And then we just have a few more questions if you have time. Do you have time, Dr. Miller?
Sure, I'm good. Yes.
Okay, cool. So How long during the season do Eriophyid on conifers feed? Pretty much all season, or does it depend on where you live?
As far as I know, they will feed pretty much all season. Now, I've seen them on bald cypress on some of our plants at the Arboretum in the past. There, it's been more kind of a early to mid-season issue. But as far as I know, they're not as sensitive to hot weather like we see with the cool season mites. But I definitely, you want to be out there early and checking for them early in the season. Now, if you're in a climate where you don't really get very hot at all during the summer months, they could potentially be active all summer. But we usually see them building up early, and then once it gets hot, they kind of, you see the damage, but they kind of drop off after that. But that's just my general impression on that.
Cool. All right, we've got one more question around the rotating thing. So unlike a deer that keeps returning, I've always wondered about the tolerance and changing of product. If we're killing the insect, then doesn't the new life cycle not have a tolerance?
Well, if you're talking about deer, I'll send you some, because we got a ton of them here around our campus. They just eat everything. But what we have to understand about resistance is, first of all, the resistance that we see in any organism doesn't just drop out of the sky. It just doesn't happen all of a sudden in terms of it, spontaneous. Those organisms, the genetic resistance, the DNA, if you will, is there in that organism. Now, if that organism is never exposed to anything that requires that resistance to develop, it just kind of flies under the radar. But the minute you start putting pressure on that mite, for instance, then that resistance becomes expressed. And of course, like I said earlier, you can go in and spray a plant for anything, and you may get 80–90% control, which is good, but there's always going to be a few that are going to survive. And those that survive for whatever reason, maybe they were out to lunch when you sprayed, maybe they were hiding, or maybe they have resistance, they're going to pass that genetic material on to their offspring. And you can actually follow this as you go along in these life cycles, and particularly insects and mites that have multiple generations. It's going to move pretty quick, and each population that survives is going to provide more and more of that resistance. So more and more individuals are going to survive each time you spray. So that's really the whole thing here. A lot of people think these organisms, all of a sudden, it's just spontaneous resistance. No, it's there. It just hasn't expressed itself yet because there's not been any pressure put on it. We're really doing, in reality, we're doing what Darwin talked about with survival of the fittest. We're accelerating that process. In nature, yeah, it goes on in nature as well, but it's a much slower process because of the pressure that's being exerted compared to what we're doing as humans with our activity. So that's why, again, we have to be very careful with that. I'm not anti-pesticide. I'm not poo-pooing any of that. I'm just saying it's a tool like anything else, and we have to use it appropriately and judiciously, or it's going to come back and bite us. And then we've seen it time and time again. Go back and study DDT in the 40s and 50s, classic example. And so anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've done a good job differentiating. And I hope all of you who are Rainbow clients know that we try to do the same thing and make responsible, judicious recommendations as well. So, okay, a couple more questions. One, I've heard that a heavy stream of water from a hose can help knock down mites and control populations. Is this true?
Yes, that is true.
Cool.
You can knock off sawflies, you can knock off mites, aphids. In fact, I can remember years ago, I was doing what I affectionately call my kill 'em and count 'em work on aphids on spirea. And I'd go out there, we had these in pots, and I had a good aphid population. We'd get a thunderstorm that night and go through and wash them all off. So yes, you can definitely, that's something that your homeowners can do, clients can do if they want. But again, understand that's not going to kill them. It blows them off the plant, and then of course they can probably find their way back, or if there were any eggs there that didn't get dislodged, they're going to hatch and do their thing. But yes, that is definitely an option if you want to just use a good strong stream of water and wash the plants, certainly.
I've sold that as an application as a sales arborist. So yes.
I'm sorry, what?
I said, I have sold that as an application as a sales arborist. So yes,
Yeah.
having a truck that has PSI and clean water can work
Yeah.
in some circumstances.
Well, it's temporary, but yeah. In fact, quite frankly, it would probably be comparable to using an oil or soap, because like I mentioned, they don't have any residual properties. So yeah, if you're willing to come back in another few days or whatever you need to do and do it again, that's fine. But that gets into the whole time management and efficiency and all that sort of thing.
For sure. Okay, this is a good question, which is, do you have a good resource for where you can find or buy the Coincide book? It is out of print and couldn't find it. Do you know?
Yes, there's a second publication. They did a second printing. The original publishers did not reprint it, and another publisher took it up. So if they would email me, I can give you my email address. It's very simple: fmiller@jjc.edu. I'll be glad to send you that information on for the publisher. But yeah, they did change publishers after the first edition.
Cool. And then one last one, which is, what is your recommended time for treating boxwood mites?
Well, to be quite honest with you, we don't get much boxwood mite here in the Midwest. At least I'm not seeing much of it. Our biggest culprit is the psyllid, the little aphid-like insects that causes the galls. I would say be out there looking on that new foliage pretty early, right along with the psyllid. That's really more of an issue we have affecting boxwood, but definitely would be out there probably close to when you're seeing the Eriophyids, maybe at 50 to 100 degree days, and see what's going on and apply then. But anytime you have new growth, new nice lush foliage, that's where they're going to tend to be, because that's much more favorable for feeding and that sort of thing. But I'd be out there pretty early, particularly on a broadleaf evergreen like that, where they're going to start putting out pretty early. And of course, watch for your boxwood blight. That's getting to be an issue. But psyllid, the mites, and the boxwood blight, yeah, those are things that you want to keep an eye out for on those plants.
Yeah, you could also just remove every boxwood and I'd be happy. Anyway. Okay, well, thank you so much, Fred, for your time. I want to thank everyone who's still here for attending. I think you got the CEU code. We've all got you. If you haven't, there's other webinars coming up. We'd love to have you. There will be a survey that follows us with this webinar. So if you could take a minute to fill it out, I would appreciate your feedback. Otherwise, please let us know how we can be of assistance to you, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much.